Hey everyone, welcome to the EarthRise podcast number 89. This is Derek Ferris. And before we begin today's very important conversation, I just want to say that the last two podcasts I've had Matthew Remski and Julian Walker on, we've been talking about conspiracy theories in the cross-pollination of right-wing extremism with the yoga and wellness community. And we got a really good response from that. So we have started our own podcast called Conspirituality. So if you want to look that up on your podcast provider, it's also on my website, but we'll be releasing that every Thursday now. Our first one was last week. So if you'd like that conversation, we're continuing it over there. Today I have, look at, you can't see his video yet, but I want to ask what that's, one of my oldest and closest friends who's been on, this is his third time on the podcast, but in life that we've talked hundreds or thousands of hours by now, and about the topics we're going to talk about today. And I have an intro plan, but I can't even get into it because part of the problem that I see is, and that we will get into, is that right now, a lot of white people have ideas about what to say when they should really just stop talking and listen. And that Dax published an article over the weekend called "A Letter to My White Male Friends of a Certain Age." Let's start there with Dax explaining why he wanted to publish that, what it says, and then we'll let the conversation go on from there. So hello, Dax.
What's up, good buddy? I just gotta say, like, you're the most enterprising person I know. Like, it's incredible. Like, you have an idea one week and it's an action the next week. And I think, whenever I think about our friendship and what has been a deep and abiding foundation of that friendship, it has been nourished through like action and sort of forward momentum and a real, like, deeply inspired desire of, to continue to be curious and move forward. And so you keep living that life, man, and it keeps inspiring me. So I appreciate you, and I appreciate you having me back on to talk to folks, share about this piece. So I got the idea originally when a buddy of mine called me on Friday afternoon, and I realized that this is weird. This is now like the fourth or so person a white friend who's reached out in one form or another and said something along the lines of, I don't know what to do right now. And I was like, yo, did an email go out? Did like a tweet go out? Like, what's going on here? Why are all my white friends calling me about the same? And this guy and I hadn't talked in years. We hadn't talked in a few years, and we hadn't been close no longer than that. So that inspired me in the midst of the conversation, because he and I had we've been friends now since we were 10 years old. And after the call, I was like, that just happened. And we didn't just start and end on the conversation of like, I don't know what to do. We moved somewhere. And in the course of the movement of that time that we had on the call, like, we recovered a part of our friendship. And in that recovery, we were able to begin to have some real dialogue around some of the broader issues that are being amplified through like the protest and through COVID. Because to my mind, so much of what is allowing for George, for George Floyd's story and for Breonna Taylor, for those stories to be so ascendant right now, is that COVID-19 for the last 2.5 months had already set a stage for this, and this so far as we began to really be inundated with information about the disparities and around death in particular, but specifically also around contracting of the disease. And we saw Black folks that were dying at disproportionate numbers, and so there was a stage being set for this, because folks already were becoming more aware, and we're talking about it in the context of both a president who was, once he found out that it was a racial, like that it was different, there were differential racial outcomes, he no longer saw it as a crisis. And I know you've talked about that, written about that as well. We were watching all of that shit. Like, it wasn't like that pain wasn't already happening. And I think along the way, I think some folks, there was a mobilization of people around, this feels like we're in a unique moment anyway. Like, I think all of us knew that March hit, that when work stopped, when the stock market, I'm like, whoa. I never imagined that. I'd like, all bets are off all of a sudden. And so for me, it was the getting of the phone call, but in the larger context of, and in the conversation that evolved out of, that was COVID specific, insofar as it revealed to all of Americans and probably beyond these really tragically, racially driven outcomes that we know are deeply tied to systemic issues. And then you see that video, and then you see Amy Cooper do what she did, and you find out this young woman is shot in her house. Then you see this young man in Atlanta, in Georgia, running and shot, and you're like, yo. So that was my and I knew I have a unique positionality because I have a lot of white male friends. I can, every stage of my life, from career backwards, all through my career, I have a lot of friends, and a lot of my friends are white men. And a lot of my friends as white men, I know we've had important conversations, hard conversations, but I also know that I've encountered a sensibility that it isn't, that while they're sympathetic to the issue, it's challenging for them to get to the next level of empathy and action around these issues. Like there's a metacognition that something's problematic or wrong. And you, I think, given the fact that we've had actual interactions and run-ins with the police together, like I don't have to worry about you ever disbelieving me when I say I'm being profiled, because you've seen it happen. Derek was with me, when it happened.
And that's what I was saying. As I was mentioning before we started recording, there's been at least 4 times that I recall that we've been pulled over together purely because we were traveling together. And the first one, I believe it was 99 in New York City and 140th and Broadway. That I'll never forget. But 2 police vans surrounded us.
Jump out vans, man.
Yeah, for only time I've ever had a gun pointed at my head, and it was purely because I was in the wrong neighborhood, being a white person, and they were convinced I was buying drugs, and they had been following us for an hour because they saw us go in the apartment. They had been following us, and that was the first bit.
I was your drug dealer. I was bringing you up to town to get drugs. That's what they actually believed and acted upon without any other evidence.
And then the twice we got pulled over within 10 minutes on the same highway in white towns in northern Jersey, and then in St. Thomas. And in St. Thomas, it was a black woman, a woman of color, who pulled us over, but she didn't like your attitude being an African-American man. And that was when she threatened to point a gun in your head. And we can go into that story. But being in that, and that's what because I've posted some things that people haven't been happy with this week. And friends of mine, either calling or texting or talking on social, have just been like, why can't we just get along and not be divisive? And I'm like, because it's always been divisive. Like I think that, did you see the Trevor Noah, like what he said?
No.
Okay. I mean, that was basically the summation is, if you are going to blame the looters right away and just automatically point the finger there, understand that there is a contract that has been signed in America by white people that said certain things that fulfilled their end, but did not fulfill, like African Americans, that side of the contract has never been fulfilled. And just imagine constantly, and then tying in with a couple of weeks ago, the Michigan legislature had to shut down because white men with assault weapons are standing there, and that's okay. That gets a pass. But then this does not. And yes, there is some looting, but guess what? That's why Twitter has been the most valuable media platform right now, because you're seeing people kneeling on the ground with their hands up, just getting kicked over by cops. And now it's not just people of color. It's just anyone who is mouthing off. So you're seeing it in real time. But that empathy connection, how do you teach that empathy? This is your work. This is literally your work.
Yeah. I mean, I think that for me, one of the things that's really important is that and then what I try to do in the piece is try to help white men of the certain age who I think, what I mean by a certain age is men who I think are of our generation, late 30s, 40s, even early 50s, in the sense that we're the ones with kids now, or small children. So we have a lot of opportunity there to shift and mold mindsets. We're also ascendant in our careers, or in places in our careers where we're, able to sort of have the experience and benefit of our youth, and also have the energy and vitality to continue to push forward and move some things ahead. And I know my guy friends, I'm like, y'all could do so much. But the only way that's going to happen is if you understand what racism is doing to you too. Because I do believe that human beings are wired to some extent to have an element of self-interest. So whether that self-interest is being mediated strictly through through a lens of whiteness or through blackness, you got to feel it. You got to feel it. And when you feel it, then you can't help but act. And that's what people understand. It's like, why are they out there? They can't help but be out there. You got so much inside, so much hurt inside. Because that's people talk about anger. Anger is a manifestation of hurt. And like, why don't folks understand that hurt is so deep for us? And it's because the way we've structured our societies, I know I'm going off, the way we've structured societies, that we've been able to ghettoize Black communities in America. So you don't have to see us if you don't want to, which I also point out in the piece. As a white person in America, you have the benefit of not having to interact with many or any Black people or institutions if you choose to. Your education does not require you to know about Black people. You could get into law school, med school without knowing anything about Black people. You can navigate career, become a CEO. You can live in a great neighborhood as you believe it to be and not have had to. I can't do that. I can find a great neighborhood as a Black neighborhood. It'd be harder to find in terms of maybe being aligned with some of the things that I'm interested in, because there's a lot of great neighborhoods. I live in one right now. But in terms of, I got to go through an education system that is in some ways mediated, even if I'm at an HBCU, or I got to go through a system that is mediated through the lens of whiteness. And y'all have to understand, what does that mean? What is that? You don't have to think that way. It's not an issue that you have to even be concerned with. So you have to feel it emotionally. And I argue that the way you begin to tap into the sort of understanding of what it is that we're dealing with is that racism is a public health crisis. There are cities in America that have now begun to define it as such. And what does that mean is that we begin to start to measure outcomes. I'm only asking us to expand the kind of outcomes that we measure beyond just deficit-based ones that we can talk about, that sort of inform the gaps: education, mortality, health, wealth, all that stuff. Those are important measures, but they're not the only measures, because that allows white people to think that if we're closing those gaps, we're closing all the gaps that matter, or that we don't have our own work to do in order to address the public health crisis that has affected me too. And the ways that it affects me too is that, that I can think that things that are produced by Black people are not as of the same quality. I could, choose to live in communities that are sort of homogeneous and not think that I'm a racist by doing that, but not really sort of wrestle with the fact that, why are there no people of color in this community? Why can't they also, wouldn't they choose this if they could? Well, quite often they can't get the loan, or they do, the interest rates are so high and they don't even know about redlining. So I know it's just, I want folks to understand that you've been harmed as well, because you've been deprived of a certain part of your own human experience by believing that you're superior and we're inferior, even if you don't believe it consciously, but by through some of your behaviors, actions, and choices. And people might challenge me on that, and that's okay. But that's a truth that I feel like I've earned as a man in my age who's lived through all I've lived through. I can stand in that truth and be okay with it, and still have love and desire to help everybody grow, even myself.
Now, there's a lot of images. We're going to always, with the way our media is set up, we're going to see the worst of it, and we are. And thankfully, I mean, one of the scariest things of this time is the just straight up attacks on journalists, which has been fomenting.
Yeah.
Which is frightening. And I see a lot of people on my feeds who are intelligent and I think generally well-intentioned people, but they're starting to use the MSM term, like, pejorative or derogatorily. And I'm like, you know what? Like, if not for ProPublica and the Post and the Times doing investigative reporting, You've done actually, I'm more of a columnist at this point in my life. You've been doing serious. You had a piece in the Post a few months ago. You just had a piece in the Guardian. You're doing serious investigative reporting that takes months over time. What do you think when you see both CNN getting attacked from protesters, but as well as the cops shooting bullets at them?
I mean, the beginning of it, the beginning end of it is that you condemn it. You condemn it at every turn. I have a sense that it is connected very much to a kind of, a cultural relativism that I think the Trump era has unleashed, insofar as we have devalued truth-telling and truth-seeking such that institutions like the CNNs of the world and the MSNBCs of the world, which are not perfect, and that's not about, it doesn't matter that they're not perfect, they don't need to be perfect, but their credibility has been completely kind of not just questioned as an institution, but as a fourth arm of government, or the fourth estate. So I tend to believe that this is what we're seeing relative to the ways in which journalists are being handled and dealt with and sort of regarded in this space. It's been something that's been, first of all, we know what happens internationally, been happening internationally. Journalists around the world get locked up, killed. The war on terror, we've seen this. It's now coming home. And so we're seeing it happen here, and it's shocking us in this and that way. But we need to keep the mindset that that's around the world, journalists have been persecuted. But I think here it's a stage has been set where journalists have been taken down from a pedestal where they could have been able to have this sort of autonomy to do their work. And I think some of that is connected to the ways in which the White House and the president have been able to their base, been able to really, really delegitimize that sort of what are defined as mainstream news outlets. I still believe that the New York Times has credibility and the Washington Post has credibility and the MSC. There are people who do not believe they have credibility. They believe that there is nothing credible about that. And that is rooted, it is rooted both in, I think, Trump's, in his stance and his sort of the broader sort of, what he represents. But I also do know that it's rooted in some of the ways in which elite journalism is both produced and consumed and put out in the world. It can feel as though, even as a journalist, as a Black journalist, because I deal with it as a Black journalist, I can't always tell the story I want to tell the way I want to tell it without a white editor. And I have a lot of them that are support my work and love my work, but often it's a white editor who's making final decisions about how my work is going to be produced in the world. That is still a reality in most investigative journalism outfits inside even the mainstream media. So the media space has work to do, journalism has work to do, and we're having that conversation. And I'd like to be more part of that conversation, but we got to own that as an issue nevertheless, that there's been some alienation from people who consider themselves regular folks in these institutions, one of which is journalism, that have put themselves or been placed on a pedestal. And folks feel like they've been left out of that. They feel like they don't have a voice in that. They've been laughed at, jeered, in some ways. And that's people of color too. Not like a lot of people. I don't know if all Black folks are watching MSNBC and CNN on a nightly basis. Like, yo, I don't know if that's the reality. I know I watch it some nights and I'm like, I'm not into this. I can sometimes watch MSNBC for real and I just turn it off because it does feel very much like this is a white, albeit progressive, agenda, and I'm still having a hard time understanding why it's always sort of the white left that's creating and sort of driving the narrative around change, even when it has so much to do with people who look like me. I've never been asked to be on MSNBC. I never, not to say that that's a measure for it, but it seems like there's still that white supremacy still lives in those institutions. So it's work. It has to be untangled, and we all got to own pieces of it. They're not free of or absolved of responsibility, but they should never be. We should never accept, and I would never accept, never want to happen to me or anybody I know or anybody who's doing the work, that kind of violent treatment when trying to cover the news and bring it to people. That's where I have to stand. I believe deeply as a human being and as a reporter.
Back to the topic, I just wanted to touch on that. It came into my head because it's something important to both of us. But here's a conversation that I had, and this is something I've heard before, and I wonder, especially because, was that Hamilton Heights that you lived in?
Yeah. Hamilton
Okay,
Heights.
so
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
wrote a
Yeah.
piece about gentrification back then, I remember. And
Yeah. Yeah.
so here's a conversation I had this last week. Somebody was talking about, a white person talking about their experiences not having a lot of money and trying to move into a neighborhood that was racially diverse and being told by people there, get out of here, we don't want you gentrifying, and taking that as a sign of being like, see, it's coming from everywhere, like it's not a it's not like there's one oppressive race. It's sort of, I don't want to, can't say the
Yeah.
conversation that went that deep
It's
into it, but
relativism. It's the relativism.
relative,
It's
exactly.
the
And
relativism.
how do you answer someone who comes at with that mindset?
I think what I try to help folks do is understand there's different levels of oppression. And so there's intrapersonal, like I could actually be oppressive towards myself, and I can actually sort of have negative ideas that I harbor inside of me. Then there's like interpersonal oppression, which is like the ways in which people experience it as on the individual level. Then there's institutional and ideological, even above that. What I think happens with a lot of conversations with people who are articulating that worldview is that they're only able to process it at the individual interpersonal level. They haven't really thought about how institutional racism or oppression operates, or how ideological oppression works. So they mediate their experiences not with a systems analysis or an institutional framework to help them understand why someone evil would even say that to them. Has everything to do with patterns of disinvestment in communities of color, and then gentrification that bring along with it a whole apparatus that supports their life there that did not support the life of the people of color who were living there prior to. The policing structures change. All of a sudden, restaurants open, grocery stores, all sorts of things are attracted because of what whiteness does, and because white wealth tends to have has an effect where it sort of brings more of it. Like it's a signal to people that it's safe. These are like, there's like a visible dog whistle. So I would want to do something along the lines of at least helping folks understand structural oppression. So I would recommend some of the work of a guy like this guy Richard Rothstein, who writes about redlining, and writes around like how and what has happened. And I would, he's done some great work on this, and a lot of people have. He's not the only one. Ta-Nehisi Coates' pieces years ago was about redlining. Like, I think folks need to understand what redlining is. They need to understand how it happened, what effect it had, how it continues to this day, how the banking crisis of 2007 and 2008 was exacerbated by, if not entire, and not largely like driven by, like sort of a predatory loan system that focused on communities of color, and that those folks are still not the ones who still have not recovered, even though the economy has recovered. Black and brown folks have still not fully recovered even from that '08 crisis. So keeping that in mind, even as we have a jobs report today that comes out today that said 48%, you shared it with me, 48% of Black folks are unemployed. Like, I want folks to start to develop a systems analysis. Move from the emotional place. Because I think white folks have a tendency to because we don't, again, when you don't think about racism very deeply, I don't think you've built the muscle, which is a kind of capacity to be able to not only respond to it from an emotional place. Emotion is important. I have emotion too, but we have to mediate our emotion through lenses and frameworks that history can provide us some context around, that can inform people's understanding of behaviors. I have felt like a gentrifier myself in Black communities because I've had education, resources, and opportunities that have situated me in a sort of situated me in such a way that I can have more access to opportunity and wealth. So me living in Hamilton Heights, I felt and processed my experience as a Black gentrifier. That is a thing that can happen. Now I can still get, pulled over and all those things that happen to me too. So it's not like being necessarily a white gentrifier, but I have a systems analysis that allows me to at least to interrogate why people might even be loving me in the neighborhood, because I might represent some difference too. Threats are threats. Threats of my life, my way of being, to like my sense of being able to be in place. Yeah.
So you in your article, which will be in the show notes, you link to a couple of resources, and then you also texted me that article, which I've seen bouncing around the 75 things white people can do right now. But
Yeah.
off the top of your head, you're having, I mean, you told me in the beginning, today is your white conversation. You're talking to all white men throughout the day,
Yeah.
and just friends of yours. But like, what are the top 3, 4 things that are top of your mind that people can do right now?
So I used an example of one of my conversations earlier today with a really good friend of mine. And he was livid about the police brutality component. He's like up in arms and wants to change the policing in Minneapolis. He's like, we got to change this. And I said to him, well, do you know who the sheriff of your community is? Do you know if any cops in your community might have, a record of abuse? Like we're finding out about the cops in Minneapolis. What do you know about use of force practices in your community? So it was a charge to sort of think locally. I think there's a tendency to try to focus on the biggest piece of it. We're not going to solve this overnight. I'm so sorry, white folks. We're not solving this overnight. We're going to be talking about this for a while. And it's okay, because you have a place in this conversation too. And this is about our American story and journey together. It's okay. It's okay. We don't have to get through this. We don't have to be in a rush to get through this. We've been patient. We've been very, very patient.
Yeah.
So I would start. So that's one thing. I think, I tell folks like, what Black businesses do you cover? Like, when Killer Mike did that video, he did the Netflix episode on his show when he's like tried to buy Black for a couple of days, and he couldn't find anything to buy Black. It was hilarious and it was tragic. There are folks that are Black creators and creators out there. There are Black bankers out there. When you think about your next, like who you might be as your financial advisor or your lawyer or your whatever, maybe add some folks of color to that list of people that you might at least want to interview and talk to, because the challenge is that I think white people have a tendency to assume, implicitly white is right, and sometimes it might, a white person is right. A lot of times white people are right. That doesn't mean white is right. That doesn't mean that they are synonymous terms, and they're like, so I would just ask to break that up a little bit and think about like, how can I, support establishments, businesses, whatever else have you, that are, that are POC owned and led, and to not think that's a problem. Like, we right now in particular, like we're being harmed and hurt in this crisis, like everybody else, but we see that there's some disproportionality there. So I think there's that. And the second thing, you asked, a third thing. If I could think of a third thing, it would be really to just do, it's like the interpersonal work around your emotionality as it relates to this experience. Like what's coming up for you? Like what's coming up for you? Are past experiences coming up for you? Like, what have been your experiences with Black folks in the past? Maybe they've been fraught. Maybe they've been conflict. Maybe they haven't been the best, but like, let's explore what was going on there. And have you used that experience as a frame for all of your experiences? Have you used that person that you might have had a bad experience with, or that with, as a way to kind of assume other things about the broader experience of interacting with people across difference? So I just think that taking some time to check in internally and process. I talked to a buddy today who didn't learn about the Tulsa riots until he watched The Watchmen on HBO this past season. And then he didn't believe it right away. He disbelieved it. He admitted that, and then he did the research and he found out about Black Wall Street, and he found out what happened. And it was heartbreaking for him to find this out, but it was enlightening for him to discover that this place called Black Wall Street existed. But then I could then tell him that, Human Rights Watch did a report on Tulsa and policing in Tulsa this past like a year ago. And they've actually geo-mapped all the sort of hotspots where policing has been concentrated in Tulsa, and where like use of force is being used excessively, and where people of color are being over-policed. And it sort of maps over directly where the Tulsa riots happened. So it's like, here you have an event that's almost 100 years old, and you're still seeing people living through multiple generations of that. And people will ask, well, why couldn't they just kind of rebuild and go forward? That doesn't happen that way for Black communities. Like, you got to get the banking industry to be supportive of it. You have to get real estate supportive of it. You have to get law enforcement to protect you. You have to have a political environment that supports you. And if you have none of those, then you cannot move forward. And so what people then see, what shows up for them in their feed, is what they have defined in their mind as bad behavior.
Hmm.
Not ever having attachment to the context and the pain and the struggle and the injustice that brought it about. And I think there's a capacity for us to accept that America has tolerated this injustice and still believe that America has the capacity to and has been in the past. Amazing. I don't think they have to be two. It's not a both and.
Mm-hmm.
To accept this about our history is not to lose an American identity that is one of like something to be proud of. It just means like any family that you're in, there might be some shit up in there that you got to fix.
Moving from, I mean, your examples of three were on the more micro level, which is, I think, often overlooked because people feel crippled and not able to do anything. One other thing, and I forget who either wrote this or it might have been on Morning Joe, they were talking about this, but the idea that you have to pay attention to local elections for your sheriff, for your judges, things of that nature too, which is important. But I want to think macro on a couple of questions. And one of them, you know, I was talking to my wife about like what's going on with just leadership in general. And I was like, you know, a couple of years ago, Puerto Rico would have wiped out any president. Right. If that response had done any other president, that would have been like a Bush Katrina moment that really put a dent in. But because it's Puerto Rico and because it doesn't affect the base, it didn't really matter. And this has been throughout. Like this keeps happening, right? With Native Americans and the pipeline, like this keeps happening. This is the first time. I mean, talk about what we didn't want to happen with this president. A pandemic followed by this, right? Like and it's just insane. What, I mean, you probably saw yesterday with the clearing out of the street of the peaceful protesters to get the photo op in front of the church.
Yeah.
And then the bishop comes out and be like, don't, like, this is insane right now. So on a macro level, you talk about 48% of adult African-American men not working or African-Americans not work or unemployed because of this right now. How do we get that fixed? Like, and I know it's going to take time, obviously. I mean, I saw projections saying it's going to take 10 years to get back to where we were if we want to, which is crazy, but that's the reality. But I mean, how do we start piecing that together?
I mean, I'm going to sound glib when I say this, but I don't mean it to be glib. We just printed what, $3-4 trillion. We just printed it. Wasn't there before, then it was there. So what we proved to ourselves in this moment is something that we could never say that we can't do. Money is energy. We can put more money into we can inject more resources into the system. When the Fed said that we will not let the markets fail, my stock portfolio is actually almost doing as well as it was on February 19th when it was at its peak. How do you explain that? So what I think my answer to the question is like, we have to understand at this moment that a lot of the things we've told ourselves about what we can't do are just not true. There were constructs, and those constructs have now been exposed as such, and that we can create new constructs. And so the construct we might want to create around healthcare, for instance, is one that is just that healthcare is a right and that you have it. And let's just be done with it and let's just move on, because I don't want to hear you tell me you can't pay for it anymore. You printed $3.5-4 trillion, right? Education, you can cancel student debt, right? It's doing nothing but saddling people. Why are students paying debt, particularly when we talk about back to the United States? Why am I paying, as a Black man, why am I paying you interest on a loan? Why am I paying you anything back? Why am I paying you back? I pay you back every day. But the work I show up to do and we show up to do in the fight and the tolerance of this, why? Let it go. You know, so there's that. We got issues around like housing, you know, we've got to figure out something. We can't just keep protecting homeowners only. We got to protect renters too, for real. Yeah. You know, so I keep hearing about, oh, we'll do forbearance. We'll do, you know, we don't want to just say, listen, we need to forgive it right now and not come back a year from now and ask you to give it back to us. Let's just let that go. Let's just give folks a clean slate right now. We can do that. So it sounds pie in the sky, but I keep saying it, we printed for whatever $1 trillion and started just sending people checks. Industries we saved. We can do it when we want to. The question is, can we do it for Black people? Will we do it for people of color? Not just Black people, people of color. Will we do it for, this is Pride Month? Will we do it for our LGBT community? Will we do it for, you know, trans folks? Will we do it for folks who are immigrants? Will we do it for these people? I think that, like, it was an interesting moment, the end of April towards the beginning of May. I was almost like, oh, I'm worried now, because it feels like folks have moved back into a sort of complacency and normalcy, or moving as this kind of thing gets normalized. And the pandemic was being normalized. And it felt like the possibilities were shrinking again. Because there was this moment in March and early April, I was like, the possibilities are boundless. Then I started to see them, I felt like the possibilities were closing back into sort of like these very normative notions of recovery. What this moment has done is reignited and exploded it again, and our possibilities are available to us once again. So this idea of what we're going to do about it is like, there's an incredible untapped potential in these men and these people and these lives that have been under-leveraged, underutilized, underseen. We need people to invest in us individually, but systemically and collectively. We need it to be okay if there's some decision made around Black folks if we decide in this country that we want to make some kind of reparations, like actual monetary, we need to not get angry about that. We need white people, don't get angry because Black people get some actual money don't talk about what are they going to do with it. They're going to just spend it on this. That's not really for you to decide. It's okay. You know, like, the reality is the main way people build wealth in America is through home ownership. And we have documented history of Black folks being denied home ownership access by both private and public industry that goes back to the 1930s. It's okay if Black folks get a little bit of love right now. Don't freak out. Don't freak out. You know? So I don't know if that answers your question, but I just, you know, that's an important piece for me to consider right now, is dreaming really big, because the possibilities have opened, because the constructs have demonstrated that they are just that, constructs and things we've chosen to believe.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to put into motion ideas if you want to see them manifest, and they are possible, but they aren't possible at the top level right now, which is the hard part. How concerned are you?
Yeah.
I mean, so here's something that is repetitive. The podcast I opened this one about, talking about the new one that I have, really started because of this merging of QAnon right-wing ideology infiltrating the left wing, specifically sort of the wellness community, the anti-vax community, right? And these are all intersections that I've been around for a long time, and watching these things merge has really taken me off guard in some ways. But I've been writing health and science for a decade now, and did we have the best response to the pandemic? No, and that is specifically because of leadership and because of lack of testing. I mean, that's a very straight line. So could we have not shut down everything? Yes, it is possible, but not without testing. So what we did was we tried to staunch a very bad wound very quickly. And, you know, it's not the best, but it was the best we could do given what we had and what governors were equipped to do at the time. But I use that as context, because now I'm seeing those same people who have thought that this whole thing has been a conspiracy in some capacity, or that we shouldn't have done that, say, oh, now it's okay that people are protesting and rioting, even though the pandemic is going on. And I will be honest, like, I am concerned that over the next month, we're going to see a spike in levels of this. That is definitely worrisome. But as I've explained in my private conversations, people are just tired. Like, they hit a boiling point. You cannot, my entire life, I've watched this happen. And at some point, it can't hold. Like, the system, you cannot have a trillionaire.
Yeah.
You can't have a trillionaire. Like, there's a trillionaire is not something that should happen, period.
Should be outlawed. Yeah.
So going off of that, how would you respond to somebody, be like, with the given the context of the pandemic right now and people putting their lives, when they come at you with that sort of argument?
The argument, so like
they're risking, you know, it was okay to be inside, and now all of a sudden they're protesting, and it's not. I mean, again, they're treating it like a black
Yeah,
and white, and I just don't see it
yeah.
as that.
They're saying, so just let me understand, like, to follow the through line, that the idea of being out in protest right now is okay, or that it's problematic. You know, are you asking that?
They're saying that people are being hypocrites
Who are these
because they
people?
were,
Who are the people that are being, the people that are out protesting are being hypocrites?
yes.
Okay. Okay. Yeah. And I go back to the point that you were raising about being bottled up and yeah. I mean, listen, I tried, I've seen images, and I think that, to be quite honest, and I'm not out there, but I don't think people are intentionally not trying to like, socially distance, even in the context of protest. I mean, I've seen images of people actually moving along and with some distance between them. It's not like, obviously, when people are converged and when they're like coming up against barricades and those sorts of things, that's going to push and compress people together. And absolutely, there could be some flare-ups in those moments. But I'm not going to sit there and attribute and assume that these people out there are out there completely reckless. You know, like, why do I have to assume that these folks aren't making conscious choices, even in moments where they might not appear to be, or I might not? I'm not in there to know what folks are doing. They might still be socially distancing. I think folks want to live. I think folks do have people at home that they know they're going to go home to. Maybe it's like some children or whatever. It just means that much for them to be out in these streets. It just means that much. It's like, to not be out there and to sort of continue to self-isolate and to do the work that the government is telling them to do. It would feel like, in some ways, it would be, you know, it would be traitorous to the moment that is demanding that they move. And I think that actually, if you reframe it, so let's reframe, because I'm always about reframing. You reframe it, it's like, you know, I have to admire these Americans who are out there protesting, and even though they're risking their lives. Now, how about if we thought about it like that? You know, like, we put some admiration on the risk that they're taking in the service of and in the name of their beliefs in this thing that we have called free speech and standing up for human dignity and rights. Like, just a simple reframe. And yeah, maybe there is risk involved. Absolutely, there's risk involved, but that's also, but if you reframe them to see them as American patriots, the vast majority of them who are out there marching because they believe in the principles of this democracy and they want to uphold the republic. If you see it that, then you might have a bit of a different, you might not harp so much on that element of things. Now, will there potentially be a flare-up? I'm not an epidemiologist, I'm not a health official, I don't know. I think we're all in a wait and see, and I think, if nothing else, you know, the health officials have demonstrated to me, and this is no shade on them, but they demonstrated to me in the last few months that they're figuring this out as they go along. They don't know what's going to happen. No one knows. So try to predict beyond that is not, well, don't know. You know, I don't know. But just, yeah. But I do think that let's think about just trying to honor the risk that folks are taking, in a way. Like, recognize that the vast majority of them are doing it because they feel like they have to do it. And it might be as a thing of solidarity, because there are a lot of frontline workers, disproportionately with people of color, who had to be, they had to be out there to deliver our food. You know what I'm saying? Like, to get us our Amazon, Prime, so.
Yeah.
Um,
So last question, because I've also been thinking about this with you. You're close to some of the main action in Brooklyn where you live, and I think about what it must be like right now being a Black family, meaning you have a 1-year-old. Like, how, as she starts to become conscious and, starts to talk and communicate, how do you navigate this territory having an infant?
I write to her pretty much every day. I write long letters to her that at some point in her life, she'll get a vault that she'll open, and it will tell her about this time. And it will be about me personally and what I was going through, and it'll be about what I'm seeing in the news and relationships and her mom. And so I look at her a lot, and knowing that she can't possibly know what's happening, and that's okay. And I got her, and my job is to protect her, to make sure that she's good. And she is, because the folks need to understand that, by and large, Brooklyn I feel safe. I don't feel like unsafe. I think what folks are not also recognizing is that these, at least so far, a lot of these uprisings that are happening, these looting, if you will, that's happening, I don't mean to put it in air quotes to diminish it for those folks who do believe that like looting is really deeply problematic. I don't agree with it. I wouldn't do it myself, but I also respect people who have a different perspective around it. But it's not like folks are burning down their neighborhoods right now. So historically, folks have always said that was always the way that, you know, people criticize the riots of the 60s. Like, why are they burning down a neighborhood? Why are they burning a neighborhood? In New York, they're going to Soho. They're going to the Upper East Side. They're
Beverly Hills.
They're going to the symbols of capitalism, and they're going there. So I don't personally feel like they're coming for me. If they were coming, and they're not. And I think that I'm not saying that that's condoning what's happening, but I think folks just need to understand that, you know, there's strategy and tactics here, and you don't necessarily agree with them or understand them. And that's something maybe you want to do some deeper learning around, but it's not just, it is like there's definitely bedlam and chaos and things that are happening that are out. But a lot of what's happening is people are making strategic choices. And one of those is to not put lay neighborhoods under siege such that people can't move around. The elders can still move around the community. You know, like the faith seekers and the goers, like folks can still go for a run and they can still be outside and get air. I can go to Prospect Park. And to me, that is something that I think folks don't know about Brooklyn. They think that we're just living in this fucking, you know, like, you know, even in war, people lived. Even in wars, people carry out a semblance of a life, you know, and that's what we continue to do. And so for my daughter, I'm like, damn, yo, you came into the world at a cataclysmic moment. And I hope that the world that she comes of age in is the one that we are making right now. And that world is one we can be really proud of.
Nice. Actually, I have one more question. I don't mind. I don't think you mind talking though. Because it just came up when you were saying that, but you have done for decades, a lot of group work, specifically with college age students, but you go around and you work with groups over the course of a weekend. And one thing that has come out in my work with this conspiracy theory wellness project, and this is a constant problem, and you know this from the yoga community, and I'll put that in air quotes, but this sense of privilege, right? And it's coming about. I really feel that in my lifetime, this is the first time with the pandemic specifically, and now we're seeing it spill over into the race issue, but this is the first time that white people specifically were asked to sacrifice. And I mean, you know, there have been personal sacrifices, but as a culture, the just staying inside and doing everything is the sacrifice since the first time. And seeing how some people reacted to that just brought out the level of privilege to 11, right? So when you work with people, and it could be any race or however you want to approach it, but how do you show people the privilege that they've had, and then how do they work through that?
Wow. I mean, listen, we have, as facilitators, we have, you know, we have interactive activities, like that are activities that happen inside the body that folks, you know, are asked to, because sometimes you need to sort of hack your sort of normal modes of processing experiences. And so you might be asked to do something with your body because there might be ways in which your history lives inside, you know, parts of you that you aren't even conscious of, or you might have not really reflected on how a certain experience that you've had is a privileged experience. You know, I might not grow up in America thinking that, you know, having my parents pay for me to go to college is a privileged experience, but that's a privileged experience. So to that extent, you need to understand where you need to start to have, you know, look at some data, you know, interact with data, because, you know, quantitative data, and also don't devalue qualitative data. Like, people's lived experience matters. You know, believe people when they tell you their story. Don't feel like you need to go find an expert to, you know, vouch for everything they say just because they're not somebody that you would define as an expert themselves. Then it's also like looking at quantifiable and quantitative data, and you can look along so many different measures. And so if I'm talking to somebody about the privileges they might have experienced, and they, you know, themselves have gone to, you know, they went to college, they have, you know, they don't have like student debt, or they went to college and they live in a neighborhood that they feel is safe. Like, I'll do an activity and I'll say, ask everybody who feels like they live in a neighborhood that's safe, stand up. And people will see who's sitting down. Stand if you have somebody in your family who's been incarcerated or experienced the criminal justice system. Have everybody in the room stand up and see who's sitting down. sometimes you don't even know who's sitting next to you, because so many of us learn how to just live with our experiences. So you think the me you encounter, the me that you encounter on an Ivy League campus, I had the same experiences as you to get me to that place. You don't know that maybe I'm the first in my family to be here. You don't know that I had X, Y, and Z. But so you do activities that allow people to understand and experience, and in silence, don't talk about it right away. In silence, see how other people are showing up in the room. And that helps people have some light bulb moments. Silence is really important in activities. You really helping people honor it, because we know a lot of folks are uncomfortable. Just like you said, folks were uncomfortable being in a house and uncomfortable sort of having that privilege. A lot of that was the discomfort of stillness. The discomfort of stillness, and that what it stimulates is a restlessness and an anxiety, and you want to quell that thing. So some of the things I do as a facilitator is I try to facilitate stillness, quiet, and help people be in it and be uncomfortable in it. Sometimes I'll throw a question out there and nobody will answer for a while. And I just let that thing sit. You know how uncomfortable that is when you have a full room full of people and a question and nobody wants to answer because they know if they do so, it's risk involved. But then somebody does it. And when that somebody does it, everybody else, it's like you feel the room shift. And all of a sudden people can begin to talk. So that's one way of doing it. So I think folks got to look at data and think about, you can look at data around wealth and wealth inequality. You can look at data around education opportunities, and just see where you fall relative to where like either your local community or national, or sort of the national trends are. And you might find that you have experienced a number of things that other people have not been able to experience. We often talk about the criminal justice system and experiences with police, and quite frankly, I don't even like talking about them anymore, but they're important and symbolic, and they need to be lifted up in these moments. But there are other ways that people experience these disparities, like it's not just about like, was I followed in the store, or was I like, there's, could I get a loan, right now? Or do I have somebody I could go to in my life who, if I needed some resources, I could to my parents. I couldn't go to my parents for money ever, you know what I mean? Like I had to pay for my education by and large by myself. My father passed away, I paid for his funeral. I did not have funeral, it wasn't, so I'm starting off in a different place than people are in life as a result of some of that. So I know I'm going long into it, but I just think that look at data, understand where you are relative to some really like these kind of measures of health and well-being in our society. Do you have health insurance? Right now, to have health insurance in our society means you're privileged. Bang. That's it. You got privilege. And nobody's saying you have to give up your privilege. So that's the thing about it. Like, we need to redefine what it is such that everybody else can have it too. It shouldn't be something that's exclusionary. It should be something that we call either a right or some other term we determine for it, but it's not something that's predicated upon either I have enough money to get it, I'm of a certain background, Like, we need to make it available to folks.